Rubber 24, or do you need taxi with Victor? Taxi with the Echo, Rubber 24. Here it goes. That clock is ticking. Okay, you here,
Welcome back, DCS Hacks fans. It's Cabby599 with you again on Garf's channel. Hey, recently I was doing a project with Garf and Avalanche, and I was trying to explain to them how to fly a military overhead pattern. And so I thought I'd just go to YouTube and show them a video, but when I got to YouTube, I didn't really find anything that talked about how the whole military overhead pattern worked. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different videos that guys make on how to do an overhead break and the pattern to a landing, but they don't talk really about closed patterns and outside downwinds and VFR entry points, things like that. There was one for the T6, but it had power settings and everything. It took like 25 minutes. So then I realized I think I'm going to have to make my own video. So here it is. How to do a military overhead pattern, how it works. We're going to use a simulated Nellis runway 21 right. And you can see my little T-30, my black T-38, of course. They're at about 5 mile initial. Nothing's to scale here, okay? So when you request an overhead pattern with a tower, Dragon 11 requests the overhead. Tower will say, report 5 mile initial. So normally they will grant, or they will have you report either anywhere from around 3 to 5 mile initial. And when you get to that point, you're going to call Dragon 11 as initial. And then you're going to fly up at pattern altitude and fly over the runway until you get to the first third of the runway, which is called the break zone. At that point, you're going to go into an overhead break, which is typically 60 degrees of bank, 2 Gs for fighter type aircraft. And then you're going to end up on inside downwind. Now, inside downwind is where you're going to decelerate the aircraft and configure the aircraft. And inside downwind only is associated with coming up initial. And I'll explain that a little bit more later when we get to the closed pattern. So here's where we're going to decelerate, configure the airplane until we reach what's called the perch point, which is essentially a 45-degree angle over your shoulder to the threshold. Get the airplane trimmed up and slowed down, and then you're going to be doing what's called the descending final turn until you roll out on roughly around a 3/4 mile final for your fighter type aircraft until you do your touch and go. Accelerate the airplane, clean it up, and then you're going to request closed. Closed pattern is to try to keep the aircraft close to the runway so you can do multiple touch and goes, as many as you can until you run out of fuel. Once they grant you a closed, you're going to be doing a climbing turn back up to pattern altitude, and then now you're going to be on closed downwind. Remember earlier I said inside downwind is only associated with coming up initial. When you do a closed pull-up, you're going to roll out on closed downwind. The reason the military made this type of pattern is that they can cram more airplanes in a smaller space. So therefore, while you are doing this descending final turn, some other guy might come rushing overhead. That's why it's called an overhead pattern. Okay, and then that way they can pack more airplanes into a smaller space and more airplanes can do touch and goes. So let's take a look at this at semi-real time coming from 5 mile initial. Of course, you just called initial. So you're going to be coming up now in a T-38 F5. That's typically 300 knots. Okay, most other fighter type aircraft anywhere from 250 to 300 knots. At pattern altitude, into the break zone, into the break, decelerating on inside downwind, configuring until you reach perch point, and then a descending final turn until you roll out on roughly 3/4 mile final, and you do your touch and go, clean up the airplane, accelerate, request closed, closed approved. You do a closed pull-up on the closed downwind, and do another final turn and do as many touch and goes as you want until you run out of fuel or time, whichever occurs first. You may be wondering, hey, what happens if you request closed and you're denied? Unable closed, breakout, report flex. Or they may tell you, execute local climb out at or above 4,000, report flex. Well, flex in this case is what's called a VFR entry point. So now you're going to fly what's called the outside pattern. Okay, this is a bigger pattern, takes longer to get around. That's why you want to stay in the closed pattern so you can do more touch and goes. So at this point, you're going to have to do a climbing turn perpendicular to the runway, and that's called the crosswind. Turning on to outside downwind, don't forget to report flex. You're going to continue on outside downwind until you get to 90 to initial, until you reach 45 to initial, and then back on to initial, reporting initial. Now you're in the overhead pattern again. Into the break. You're on inside downwind, configuring, slowing, descending final turn. Roll out on 3/4 mile final. Do your touch and go. Clean up the airplane, accelerate. Request closed, closed approved. Close pull up onto closed downwind. And here's what it looks like in real life. All right, guys, that's all I really have for you today. Hope you learned something, and don't forget about Garfy there. Let's give him a thumbs up and subscribe. And remember,